I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that we stand on Untitled land and by acknowledging our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Mcdonough to the east, the Mohican and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm the director of the Botanic Garden here. It's great to see you all. I heard parking has been a little bit troublesome. You know, we planned, this is our weekend, and I guess if you're going to have a Dead concert, you just do it whenever you want. So we might have some people coming in late, but please just welcome them in. Welcome to the opening reception for the 2019 Fall Show. I have to thank lots of people who make this event possible. And first of all, I'll say please make sure to join us after Duron's talk for refreshments and a preview of the Ball Show in Lyman Conservatory. As you look at how beautiful the show is, think of all the work that goes into that, especially our horticulturalists, Dan Babineau and Steve Zykowski, as well as our conservatory curator, Jimmy Grogan, have been working hard to put this show together for months. Our Smith College work study students, Bailey Whitney, Clarity Phillips, and Selena Lewis Bartley, have been also working side by side. Our outdoor work study students also pitched in today to make sure that everything was spotless and beautiful. And also we have to thank our horticulture students who potted up many of the bulbs that are now on display many weeks and months later. And I also want to thank Sarah Loomis, our manager of education, for all the work that she put in bringing us to tonight's programming. There's a couple of folks in the crowd that I want to thank as well. Our Friends Advisory Committee is here. This is a dedicated group of alumni whose lives and careers have been impacted by their interactions with the Botanic Garden and Smith College, and who are committed to ensuring similar experiences for today's students and our broader community. They've traveled from Mississippi, California, Minnesota, Tennessee, and New York to get here, and so I'm really grateful that they can join us here tonight. I also want to thank the chair of our Friends Advisory Committee, Connie Parks. Is Connie here yet? She will be here for sure, who really keeps this group together. And then if you've been to our events in the past, you might know what's coming next, which is, if you're a member, would you mind just raising your hand if you're a member of the Botanic Garden?
Amazing.
Can we give our members a round of applause? I have this dream in my head that we all come back to each one of these every 6 months or so. We meet after these, and I ask that same question. I acknowledge our members, and I know one of these times everyone is going to raise their hands. And so I want to just encourage you, if you're not a member, to please become a member. It's really easy. It's on the upper right-hand corner of our webpage. And if you're heading over to the Ball Show, you can also join in person. Join because our programming speaks to you. Join because it's good for our community. Join because you believe in the transformative power of opportunity, mentorship, experience, and plans. So I hope you will join in and help us out. I'll introduce Sarah Loomis, our manager of education, for a brief introduction of Duron.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for being here this evening. As Tim said, my name is Sarah Loomis. I'm the manager of education here at the Smith College Botanic Garden. I have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, Duron Chavis. Duron is currently serving as the manager of community engagement at Lewis Ginger Botanical Garden in Richmond, Virginia. And this title only hints at the many hats he wears. He is an activist, an organizer, a self-professed plant guy, who creates synergy between corporate social responsibility, public policy, and grassroots activism to build community capacity for transformation. In the short time that he has been here, which by the way marks his first trip to New England,
Yes.
he has already shown, he's already shown his ability to build authentic relationships in our community and with those around him. Yesterday, he was on site at Gardening the Community in Springfield. Today, he met with members of Grow Food Northampton, as well as with Smith College students. I heard one student on her way out from lunch today with him just remarking that meeting him had just brightened her day. So I thought that was just a testimony to his personality and his time here.
Wow.
From poverty mitigation to urban ag to racial equity, Duron articulates the role cultural identity plays in sustainable community wellness. He challenges organizations to think outside of silos, to confront conversations of race and class courageously and authentically. His list of accomplishments include, among others, founding a highly acclaimed Happy Natural Day festival, launching the Richmond Noir Market, a pop-up farmers market targeting low-income neighborhoods in the Richmond community, and developing the Mcdonough Community Garden to transform green spaces throughout the Richmond region into urban gardens, farms, orchards, and even vineyards. As manager of community engagement at Lewis Ginter, he administers the Ginter Urban Gardener Program, a 12-week neighborhood-centric community greening training, and cultivates partnership for the creation and sustainability of public green spaces. Duron has received numerous accolades for his work, including serving in 2011 as Clean Air Ambassador on behalf of Earth Justice and the Hip Hop Caucus, receiving Style Weekly's Top 40 Under 40 in 2010, and in 2017, Duron was honored by the Richmond Times-Dispatch as Person of the Year. We are thrilled to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Duron.
Thank you. So, thank you all for just an amazing welcome. This has been an amazing 2 days. It's been a whirlwind of activity. It's been a breath of fresh air. I don't know if any of y'all heard about it, but Virginia's been going through some trauma, you know. So this has definitely been an amazing reprieve from all the things that are going on in my home state. So today I'm going to be talking about advancing racial equity through regenerative placemaking. This is my way of really trying to fit a lot of topics into one, 45 to 50-minute talk. We're going to move really fast, and I hope that we have time for robust discussion afterwards, all right? Before I get started, thank you, Sarah, for an amazing introduction. I usually spend a little bit of time just talking about myself, and I don't really have to do that today. Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden. I serve again as community engagement manager, but you might wonder, how did this guy end up at a botanical garden, right? My story is very intriguing. I started as a museum coordinator for the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. And from that space, I started Happily Natural Day, and through Happily Natural Day, a cultural festival that's dedicated to health and wellness and cultural change and cultural identity, I met African-American farmers. And it was through those farmers that I was able to really hear the importance of not only food access, but sustainable agriculture, right? And why we should be focusing on this work. But through that, I ended up digging deeply with these farmers and connecting. It takes a lot of time to farm, but to have a 75-year-old man talking to you on a Saturday for 6 hours about when to plant, when to harvest, going through the Vietnam War, and then when he shakes your hand, you're like, man, are you sure you're 75 years old? Kind of like with that tight grip. It really opened up a whole new world for me, right? So I started my first garden in 2012. But Lewis Ginter has been around since 1984. It's a 50-acre botanical garden founded by a gentleman named Lewis Ginter. You might wonder, who is Lewis Ginter? Lewis Ginter was a business mogul. He was I like to say he's the founder, or he was one of the earliest marketers of the pack of cigarettes, right? So when you hear about the mid 1800s, when people used to buy cigarettes, they buy a single cigarette, right? Or maybe one or two, and they'd be wrapped up in like a piece of paper, and that'd be how they marketed cigarettes. Well, Lewis Ginter was the genius that took a piece of cardboard and slid it inside of the paper and put printed images on the back of the cardboard, and it blew up like hotcakes, right? So in his day, he made the equivalent of today. He was a millionaire, right? So not only did he sell these cigarettes, in monopoly and all that different type of stuff around tobacco, but he was also a developer, right? And as a developer, he built entire sections of Richmond, Virginia. If you ever visit Richmond, Virginia, one of the most historic landmarks is the Jefferson Hotel, modeled after Monticello and all this type of stuff. Well, Louis Ginter builds the Jefferson Hotel, but not only does he build the hotel, he owns the bricklaying company that the hotel is made out of. So that gives you the scope of money that we're dealing with. So Louis Ginter is also a Confederate major, right? He puts his money on the South. At that moment, there's investments that he has. He's hoping that the South wins so he can get, so he can bankroll off of this opportunity. Beyond that, his work is very intriguing because, when you do the research, there's questions as to whether or not his sexuality, whether or not he was heterosexual, he had a lifelong partner, and when he passed away, he leaves his money, not to any, and he doesn't have any heirs, no children, so to speak. He leaves his money to his niece, a woman named Grace Arntz. Grace is a social philanthropist. She spends her time, investing in different parts of Richmond, transforming areas that didn't have public plumbing. If you ever look at old shows and movies of those hospital rooms with the beds lined up and you have the nurse with the white, hat and everything, and it's like the convalescent home. She had one of those on the property that is Louis Ginter, right? So fast forward, 2019, we have this space that gets left. Well, actually, let me back up. When she passes away, she leaves her money in an endowment that makes this, right? 1984, we break ground. Annually, 467 visitors, $7.5 million, and what I like to call it's a very monochromatic organization, right? And by monochromatic, I mean it's predominantly white in leadership, predominantly white in audience, and there's not a lot of voices of color that are finding themselves inside of the organization, whether it be high-level staff or even visitorship, right? So that kind of gives you a backdrop of what space we occupy and how I got there. I end up hearing about this work that Louis Ginter is doing to try to expand beyond its walls, right? This means that the garden, realizing that it is a place of privilege. Botanical gardens have this whole legacy connected to empire and connected to colonialism and, the doctrine of discovery where you have these, scientists or botanists going around the globe identifying these unique plant collections and pulling these things back and bringing them to these walled off spaces, these white castles all over the nation, right? But it's really for a select few. It's not really for the entire population to access, right? So what Louis Ginter realizes as an organization is that they find themselves in the middle of a city. Richmond, Virginia, right? Richmond, Virginia, for those who don't know, the capital of the Confederacy. It's the city where the last Civil War battle was fought after Lincoln, marches into Richmond. The city is burning. Folks are, refugees literally in the city. But the legacy that the city lives with is that in context of this reality, where 26% poverty, highly concentrated in the east and south side of Richmond due to this historical trauma. Not only slavery, and we'll talk a little bit about some more contemporary realities that have caused this trauma in a few seconds. So the garden realizes, hey, we're in the middle of a city. This land that we live on is literally owned by the city. How can we make a more intentional and deliberate impact in our region? Right? What does it mean to be a botanical garden? We do plants really well, right? We plant, amazing collections that are biodiverse. We have all of these children that are coming in and learning about STEM, but what is it that we are contributing to our greater region beyond being a cultural destination, right? So the other day, just today, I learned that Lyndon Miller, an alum of Smith College, who's also famous for her work in New York City around urban greening, she came to Louis Ginter in 2014. In 2014, her arrival and her talk about the importance of developing green spaces in community sends up a beacon into, the community, and it corrals this hodgepodge of multi-sectorial individuals, folks from municipal government to for-profit companies to nonprofit to activists, to just concerned citizens who all aspire to create a greener city, right, or a more beautiful RVA. And when she leaves our director of education and our executive leadership with this advice: keep meeting, right, and keep gathering these individuals together. And what does that? And watch what happens. So that those early meetings were really nascent, kind of amorphous organizational dumps where people will come and just network and talk about what work they were doing in community. But it soon congealed into this idea of how can these organizations collaborate to create collective impact. Like, how can we work together in order to affect change and make a greener city? Everybody's applying for the same grant. How do we partner on that grant instead of competing against each other? How do we not step on each other's toes in terms of the work that we're doing? How do we figure out what gaps exist in our city? And those ideas birthed some very strategic partnerships very early on in 2014. We got 2 grants, one dedicated to creating a community greening toolkit, right? Built a website, beautifulrva.org, where somebody can log on and find all the research as to why it's important to plant trees, how you develop a community garden, what's the research around these different ideas, and what ways you can navigate city government and et cetera. But also realizing, quickly that everyone's not that tech savvy, right? You can't expect everyone to just log onto a website and be able to pull down all the information they need in order to create a community garden. Some people, like me, maybe there's some other people in the audience, we need human-to-human interface, right? We learn kinesthetically. We have experiential learning needs. It's not just about me able to read something and then do it. It's like, I like to learn in the community. So that plus, and I don't know if this is the case in Northampton, but we would see corporate entities, invest $5,000 in developing a community garden in the middle of a neighborhood. And, they bring out their 40, 50 volunteers and they build all the pretty raised beds and plant all the plants. And then 6 months later, the garden be all weeded over, right? They say, well, how do we stop that? How do we, put a stopgap in that? And what had happened, what you would realize, is that the community hadn't been talked to, right? No one had asked that community if they even wanted a community garden, let alone if they even knew how to manage one, right? So in that space, we decided that it would be important to develop a training program. The Ginter Urban Gardener Training Program is a 12-week training. One of the things about training programs, because we can iterate around workforce development, we can talk about entrepreneurial training for folks and incubating farmers and et cetera, but there's a certain element around growing in an urban space and developing a green space in an urban environment that speaks to another layer of human interaction that's not just transactional. And in this space, the Ginter Urban Gardener Program lives not only teaching sustainable horticulture, urban garden design, project management, and volunteer coordination, but placing a strong and focused energy around community trust building. What does it mean to build trust in a community, right? And how do you create a chamber in a classroom that mimics what happens in community, right? So the training program is taught through a lens of dialogical pedagogy, which basically means instead of us having someone all the time in front of you speaking and you take all the information in and then you jot down your notes, it's a lot of conversation, right? And anybody in here knows that the garden is full of metaphors. You could talk about, you know, what are you composting in your life, right? That how you're turning, you know, bad things into good things. What are you weeding out of your life? What type of negativity? What seeds are you planting of positivity? But those types of conversations create a really amazing platform for folks to share their narrative, right? And through this dialogical pedagogy, the program is able to help people understand the importance of vulnerability, right? What happens in the classroom before we even launch the program, we only take 16 people. You know, the reason why we keep the classes small is because we want to have as much difference in the room as possible. You know, we select folks. We look at race, we look at class, we look at gender, we look at education level, we look at income. You know, we look at where you live. Our program is hyper-focused into neighborhoods. So instead of it being something where we accept applications from all over the city, we pick specific census tracts in the city where we target folks from those neighborhoods. And you say, if you apply for the Interurban Gardener Spring Cohort 2019 and you live in this neighborhood, you're almost guaranteed to get into the class, right? But the other individuals, you know, once we make that selection, we say, okay, we can't have this class be overwhelmingly black. It can't be overwhelmingly white. It can't be overwhelmingly male. It can't be overwhelmingly female. It can't be just college professors. It can't be just grassroots organizers. It can't be just people that know how to garden already. We need a room that reflects our region. So through that intentionality, we explicitly set up a difficult situation, right? Where people are so different from one another that they have to sit in the discomfort of not having the same lived experience as someone else, right? And that is the magic that happens inside of the classroom that, you know, at the same time, yeah, we learn how to grow things, right? It's a classroom-based program, so on a Wednesday night, we're talking about, you know, soil science and nutrient density. But on the Saturday, all of these folks have to work together in order to do a project, right? The program, I have a lot of pride in it because it's really important for me to not just dangle a stick in front of folks. And what I mean is, we don't just teach folks for the sake of teaching, right? We put money on the table. We say that your class is gonna have a budget of $5,000 to do a project in community. And so you're gonna have to figure out how to work together and work with the community to plan, design, and implement that training. So we like to say we plant in the hard places. So the training program, once we start, the first class, we don't even talk about gardening, right? The first class is dedicated to unpacking the 2010 census in Richmond, Virginia specifically. And we place a heavy focus on redlining because what we want to help people understand is that the roots of wealth inequity in our country have very poignant points where somebody did something very intentionally wrong, right? When we talk about that, we frame it in the context of redlining in the city of Richmond. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is an image of one of the gardens that was developed, our first garden in fact. This garden lives at a church called 6 Mount Zion. And as a result of not only redlining, but the creation of Highway 95, if you look across the country, you know, the interstate highway system destroyed a lot of urban communities, specifically black neighborhoods. And in Richmond, Virginia, this is no exception. So this neighborhood is called Jackson Ward, which was identified or called a Harlem of the South. You know, at one point, you had about 5 African-American owned banks operating in this community. Madam C.J. Walker, the first black woman bank president, you know, her bank is a consolidation of those 5 banks, and it at one point was the oldest African-American bank in the city. But this highway, 95, which is literally, that fence line is the border of the highway, when the highway was put in, over 3,000 families were removed from Jackson Ward to make way for the highway, right? What happens in the classroom is we get to unpack that, right? We talk about the historical narrative, and we also talk about the data that exists as a result of this, economic violence in the community. And what happens in the classroom is it kind of like, it creates a shared language for the entire classroom to assimilate, right? We all have to wrestle with, okay, this is about gardening, but this social strata is the soil in which we're planting, right? So it's much deeper than me going into a community and starting a garden. When I go into said community, I have to wrestle with these realities that people are living with. Generations later, we could talk about subprime mortgages. I'll talk about that in a little bit, how the connection between areas that were formerly redlined, and I'll give you a definition of that when I get to my maps. Those areas were the same areas that were targeted by the subprime lending crisis in 2008 when the housing bubble burst. Those same communities were the ones that were redlined back in the 1950s, right? So all of this is to get to the spirit or help tap and catalyze this paradigm shift of working with versus doing for. The ethos of the Interurban Gardener program lives in that space of there's a difference between doing for a community and entering into a community as a partner, right? There's a power dynamic that exists when you do for a community versus when you're working with that community. How long do you do for somebody before you expect them to be able to stand on their own? And on another level, how long are you willing to work with people in order to create a new world? It's almost indefinite, right? If you are sharing those bonds and connectivity. It's really about collaboration. And our program, essentially, the way I see it is that we invest in places and people. The idea is, I have a cohort, once they graduate, from my program, there is a new green space or an enhanced green space that they've all contributed to, but those same individuals are then deployed to green spaces throughout our city where they coordinate volunteers and work with community in order to realize a more sustainable green space, right? And what I do as pretty much my job as a resource organizer is to figure out, okay, what do you need in order to make this space sustainable? Do you need plant material? Do you need, tools? Do you need equipment? Do you need soil? Do you need trees? What is it that you need? And help me help you find those resources in order for your work to be sustainable. And so in that space, I get to play this really interesting pass-through, right? Where I work for this well-equipped, oligarchical kind of representation of a botanical garden that has all of this money from the first families of the state. In the city, but I'm able to take those grant fundings from foundations and all that different type of stuff and put it right back into the community, right? So these individuals are stewards of spaces, but then they end up being the ones that say, okay, this space needs a permeable path, right? Or this space needs, a shed, or this space needs, a pergola. And then what we do is we go about the business of finding the money from philanthropy and putting that into that community, right? So this is all a practice of finding, ways for communities to respond to their own needs on their own terms. Earlier, I talk a lot about food access, and that's kind of the world that I come from, but the gardens are not always community gardens. They're not always urban farms. Sometimes there's just somebody that says, hey man, this entire strip needs new trees in the tree well. Like, how do we affect change in that world? Sometimes it's a parklet that somebody just wants to have a green space where they can just relax and convene community at, right? And so allowing communities to iterate solutions to their own problems is like the crux of this work. So I like lists, right? And I think everyone kind of can get with like what are the top 6 steps and 7 or top 5 steps. So I'm gonna kind of shift gears a little bit into what are some of the 6 steps that you can use to activate a racial equity strategy in your work, in your community, right? So just to start off, what I say is step one is establishing a shared definition and understanding of what racial equity is, right? A lot of people have different definitions. What I found is that this illustration does a really great job, but even this is insufficient. When you look at this, this image, you see individuals, all in the same box. They're reaching for apples from off of a tree, right? And they're all of varying heights. The shortest individual can't reach the apples on the tree. But the idea of equality is that everyone has one box. So that's all equal. Everyone has the same box. But even in that space, it's not sufficient because that means one individual, even though he has a box, he still can't reach the tree, right? But that doesn't mean equity. And in an equity conversation, we're trying to figure out what it is that is an impasse for this person to have the quality of life, the same quality of life as the other people in the scenario. And so in the second image, we see individuals standing on one box, two boxes, three boxes. They're all able to reach the fruit on a tree based off of their capacity, right? And they've been assisted and worked with to build their capacity to reach the tree. Now, that's a conversation about equity. What is it that I need to do in order for you to be able to access the fruit on the tree, right? That's essentially what it's about. But I say this is insufficient because, with modern horticultural methods, we know that we could espalier this tree and it could be a dwarf variety where everyone could access it without the use of a box at all, right? And that's where we're talking about justice. How do we remove the barriers for these individuals in the first place so there's no need for a box, right? And that's really where that's where rubber kind of hits the road and where people kind of get like, okay, what are we really talking about when we're talking about equity? So when we're in a conversation about developing a strategy, it's important to come with a shared understanding. Are we talking about food justice? We're talking about racial justice. We're talking about land justice. We're talking about gender justice. What are the terms of engagement? What is this equity we're trying to figure out who's in this inequitable position and how do we get them out of it? And, assessing that definition, it requires some introspection, right? So are we using the same definitions? There are a lot of intersectional dynamics that play out that cause inequity and then also cause us to not be able to understand what an inequitable position is. So I talk a lot about power and how equity is really a conversation about who has that and who doesn't, right? And in the conversation about it, when we're talking about race, we have to deal with two dynamics, or really four. The first two are, internal issues that people are dealing with, their own biases and privileges and, and their own internalized racism for intra conversations about race. Because believe it or not, because of the trauma of living in a society afflicted by systemic racism, people of color, communities of color, deal with internalized issues as a result, right? But beyond that, when we also have to reconcile, are we talking about individual interpersonal racism, or are we talking about institutional racism, right? We understand that they play off of each other, right? For example, in Virginia, we got the blackface situation with the governor, right? And I say, well, that's more of like, an interpersonal situation where somebody did a racist act and it's like, I'm offended, right? But we know that conditioning that created this hierarchy of human values, right, plays into creating institutional policies where the individual beliefs craft policies that keep people marginalized. We're at a botanical garden, so, we could talk about Carl Linnaeus, right? Carl Linnaeus being the father of binomial nomenclature, right? He's the guy that comes up with Homo sapiens, sapiens, and all this type of stuff. But he's also the guy that segments, human families into these qualitative analysis of what the qualities of life of these, he says one is Africanus, one is Europeanus, one is Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and all these different ideas of people He says not only are they, here are their physical descriptions, but the Afrikaans, they're very lazy. The people of Americanus, they're very sneaky or deceptive. So he's what we call the father of scientific racism. So his interpersonal beliefs about people created an institution that was played out over generations, right? And we live with it every day as we describe plants. So culture and identity interweaves and creates a really amazing space where people have to reconcile their own privileges, biases, their own roles in these systems. So step 2, in developing a strategy for addressing racial equity, we have to be really clear on what we are doing in terms of empowering and engaging community. It's all the buzz now. We talk about community engagement. Organizations all across the country say they're engaging communities. Well, what is it that they mean when they say they're doing community engagement, right? Some folks, it means, we just did some surveys, right? And we asked people in the community what they want to see happen, right? There's some research, a lady named Sherry Arnstein. She has this diagram called Arnstein's ladder of civic participation. And in it, she says, the first couple of tiers are, manipulation of the community. That's not really truly community engagement. It's more of like the community has no power. And then it goes up where, you're asking people to fill out surveys or answer questions about what you can do for them, whereas it's kind of quasi-power, but it's not real power, because they're still being denied agency in their own reality, right? But then the highest level, the pinnacle of community engagement or civic participation is when communities are entered in terms of partnership, and when people are delegating resources to that community for them to solve problems on their own terms, right? And that's that's a different type of conversation. But what I try to explain when we're talking about equity, that when you're engaging in a process, it's engagement plus empowerment is what leads to equity, right? When I'm engaging that community, whether I'm asking questions, I'm listening, it's all for the purpose of me to help you have the power to determine, your reality on your terms. So that if I don't get a grant next season, you can still do the work, right? That is truly when we're starting to tap into a strategy that is fostering equity in community. Step 3, I like to talk about gathering and analyzing disaggregated data. What disaggregated data means is that there's a bunch of maps and there's a bunch of organizations that are looking at a bunch of different things inside of any community at any given moment, right? This map is a representation of Richmond, Virginia. The green dots or the greenish areas are representative of the areas that lack access to healthy food. At the same time, the bluish areas are the areas that are a lot more affluent. When you look, I used to be the guy that hated the stats, and I could not. I say this, to all of my students in the room. I used to nod off in economics class, and it really was, the research was like, okay. But as I grew in our work of community, understanding how to track real change in community, I had to start paying attention to where the data was showing there was an issue in real time. So in this representation, we're talking about these are not only the areas that are lacking in access to healthy food, but they're also the areas that are high in poverty. As I showed from the last slide, poverty level in Richmond, Virginia is 25%, so 1 of 4 people are in poverty. And so the East End, the far top right, and then the bottom left, those are the East End and South sides of Richmond. So when we start to look at the data, we start to understand what trends are happening and what exists in the space. You can't really understand it if you only look at one type of data. So step 4, now I gotta make sure I don't want to get too far off track, but this is these are several questions that I like to ask people to ask, and that we try to ask as we start to figure out what are the root causes of these issues. As I said earlier, when we go into the classroom, when we start teaching the Interurban Carnegie program, first thing we start doing is we unpack the census. So when we conduct these systems analyses of the root causes of the inequities, we have to ask questions, right? So some of these questions are, this is just a bunch of them that we just tossed on, but I'll use one for example. What are the key causes and contributing factors of this inequity that we're addressing? Is it a health inequity, or is it a wealth inequity? Is it an infant mortality inequity? What are the key factors or key causes that are contributing to this? What are some of the dynamics that are involved? Is it income, gender? Like, we have to look at what is happening in the system, right? In departments of health all across the country, the new wave or the new rave is looking at the social determinants of health, right? So that health inequity and health disparities don't arise just because people don't have access to health care, right? It's because people don't have access to housing, right? They might not have access to transportation to get to a grocery store. They might not have a grocery store in their community. They might not have an income. So, they might live in a wrong zip code. They might live in an area that's an urban heat island where, as a result of living in an area with lots of impervious surface, they are suffering from heat-related illnesses in the summer because they don't have enough money for AC. Like, all of these things compound and overlay and create, inequity. So when we're trying to figure out what the root causes are, it's important to start thinking about, I like to use the term stackable pathologies, that it's not one thing that's happening, it's multiple things happening at the same time. All right. And, in that same vein, as I was saying earlier, we start our conversation with redlining, right? So we use the historical data. For those who are not aware, redlining was or is a strategy that the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1950s went throughout the entire country. I mean, back in the 1950s, there was a New Deal, and the federal government wanted to invest in wealth in our community by helping people get access to mortgages and financing their home, right? So all across the country, these agents from the Homeowners Loan Corporation are going through communities, assessing the value of said communities, right? So the idea, the term redlining, comes from those agents going into neighborhoods and marking off the areas, those designated neighborhoods, and saying whether or not that neighborhood would qualify for mortgages or financing for the homeowners in that particular area, right? So what happens in cities across the country, there's an amazing website, there's amazing research through University of Richmond called Mapping Inequality that has all of the maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation from all over the country. And this is, that shows the areas that they marked in red, i.e. redlining, where they were assessed with a D rating, which meant they were ineligible for financing and mortgages. And now, what the research shows is that across the board, all across the country, whenever those agents went into communities that were of color, they failed the neighborhood. So they deemed all those neighborhoods ineligible for mortgages and finances. So we know that one of the swiftest ways for wealth building in our country is through home ownership. You buy a home, as a result of you buying a home, you get the equity when you sell it, right? And then when you sell that home and you get that equity, then you can start a business, you can buy another home, you can put your kids through college, any number of things that can happen as a result. So what happens for when you discriminated against an entire segment of your population in 1950s and said that nobody was able to access this step for wealth building? You instantly create this disparity. I start here when I talk about wealth inequity, because a lot of times if you go back further than that, people's eyes roll over. If you say, well, slavery, yeah, this is the biggest form of wealth and create wealth inequity, and the displacement of indigenous people in this country and their inability to be citizens of this country also created a wealth inequity. But then people kind of get woozy and they don't really want to talk. So I said, well, let's just start, 60 years ago, right? That's easy enough to swallow. My grandmother, right, was alive when this happened, right? And as a result, my grandmother was ineligible because of where she lived to access, these types of loans. So compound that with the creation of the highway system that's running through communities, compound that with other forms of discrimination in income across the board. Just coming out of Jim Crow, this is the 1964. Contrast that with white flight and the divestment from urban communities as a result of Brown versus the Board of Education, and you end up with a toxic pot of pathologies inside of urban centers throughout the country. This map is a representation of not only the HOLC maps in the city, but those dots represent the concentrations of vacant properties and the blighted and dilapidated properties that exist in our city. So as you can see, the highest concentration of blight and vacant properties are in the same areas that were redlined 50 years ago. And we also know that in 2008, to add insult to injury, that those same neighborhoods were targeted for the subprime mortgages, right? So people lost their homes. First, they were denied mortgages, and over time, they were able to foster up some form of fortitude to purchase a home, and then subprime lending came in and took what little folks were able to develop. So step 5, we say step 5 is identifying strategies and targeting resources to address those root causes. And you had to ask more questions, how to identify a strategy. Again, working with is the definitive ethos, right? And in working with, you're asking questions with the communities that you intend to work with, right? So if my favorite of days is that if the community that you seek to remedy an ill for is not in the room, then you need to start over, right? They have to be at the lead of the discussion because they're the first impacted by whatever decisions are being made. It's like somebody coming into your house and saying, this is how you need to clean up, this is how you need to arrange your furniture, this is how you need to cook your food. I think I might want to have a say in that a little bit, right? This is my house. So if we're talking about communities that have been marginalized, it makes sense that they should be at the table in the determination of solutions that will affect them first. So some of the questions, what is a specific change in policy that can help produce more equitable incomes? What positive principles or shared values are reflected in the type of reform that you're trying to do? Who can be allies and supporters, and how can they be engaged? How can those most adversely affected by the issue be actively involved in solving? These are questions that require a high level of just, looking in the mirror, but then also looking inside of the room as you're planning. Who is there? Are the people that are most affected in the room? So before asking people to be in the room with you, I try to say that it's recommended reading. You got to do some work, right? It's not just, I'm going to go knock on the door and hopefully these people just show up, just because I'm good intentioned and have sincere, desire. No, there's work that has to be done on the behalf of folks before you go into those communities. And these are some books that I recommend. There's more. I've just been reading this new book by gentleman Edgar Villanova called Decolonizing Wealth. But this book, White Fragility, is an amazing treatise on institutional racism and understanding how we as a country, as a nation, as a globe, have these really hard and difficult times wrestling with the difference between individual racism, and institutional racism. It's kind of odd. It's like to see so many disparities lined up along racial lines, but there's no one's a racist anymore. It's kind of like how are these inequities still existing if no one's a racist anymore? It's like almost like what I see happen often is when you name institutional racism, sometimes folks call you a racist for saying that there's institutional racism, which is one of the most toxic engagements that one can have. It's like, no, because we can point clearly that there are disparities along racial lines that are existent because of policies that have failed communities, doesn't make the person that's identifying those disparities a racist. What is problematic is that we often have a difficult time understanding and being empathetic to the realities that have been created. Kind of like it's one of the things that say is like America has never had to reconcile the sins of its father, right, and its mothers, right. We think that magically at some point this stuff just disappeared, but it didn't. Nobody ever did anything to undo it, even though something was deliberately done to create it, so it doesn't just dissipate. The revolution will not be funded. I hear a lot of people who talk about the philanthropic community and how they are the most important piece of the problem, piece of the solution. Well, really, no. They are a part of the solution, but they are not the end-all, be-all. It will take for-profit, they will take municipal government, it takes nonprofits, all collaborating together in order to develop solutions that are equitable and that really drive to the core of these issues that are faced in community. And then, just as far as like a philosophical framework for how we build community, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire frames a way of teaching that centers those who have been oppressed in the conversation and works to undo the conditioning of the oppressors as well, recognizing that both oppressed and oppressed are locked inside of this cycle where the folks that have done the oppressing feel as though this is just the natural way of the world. Like that this hierarchy of human values is just inherently correct. Whereas we see it, and if you don't pay attention to it, sometimes it's playing itself out without your intention, right? And then, there are others, but just the key point to take away is that when we're developing equitable strategies, it's important to focus on the idea of working with versus doing for, and just keep this idea of authenticity, transparency, vulnerability on the front end of the conversation. And then last, in terms of this first 6 steps, I'm gonna have to speed up and go through the next set of sections. But this whole idea of working in community is a continuously evolving, iterative process. This is a long game. One of my mentors says it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? And in this work, you're continuously evaluating, you're continuously adapting strategies, you're continuously having feedback and dialogue with those that are inside of the system that you're working with. And being able to be in a space where you can accept rigorous feedback, it requires tough skin. Because sometimes you might do something wrong, but it's not about backing away from the table the moment someone says, hey, that didn't work for me. It's about saying, okay, well, I'm in this for the long haul. I apologize. I didn't mean for it to be that way. How can we create a new strategy that, respects your humanity, right? So it's about, reflecting, how do we strengthen the solutions? And that longitudinalness, that commitment of us staying engaged is really what the relationship building and the community trust building does. It glues us and it bonds us together, right? We recognize that we're in the room for something that's bigger than our own individual ego, right? And that if someone is feeling away, we care for them, right? As individuals and as communities, and we want to make sure that they're honored. That's that revision, that constant reiteration can't be stressed enough. So these are 6 steps for racial equity, but what about the regenerative placemaking, right? all of that framework that I just overlaid, you can apply that in any social strata that you're working in. But we apply it through the lens of regenerative placemaking. We do this work in green spaces. We do this work in gardens, urban farms, and just developing the built environment. And beyond just this idea of creating a sustainable space, our goal is to really try to regenerate, our urban environments and create more biophilic cities. How do we get people reconnected to nature? How do we create that multi-tiered impact that nature has? I mean, everything from economic benefits to social cohesion benefits to health benefits. How do we respect all of that stuff and create spaces that are, building on not only the environmental ecology, but also the social and human ecology of place. And this idea of regenerative placemaking, there's a gentleman named Emmanuel Pratt, who's from the Sweetwater Foundation, who's really doing an amazing job of fusing art, culture, and place, as well as race, and iterating ideas that connect people across these social strata in terms of their neighborhoods. So step one, like I told you, I got lists, right? Step one for regenerating places. It's important to define the place. This is a picture of us in one of our community conversations. During our training program, what we do is that we create a community conversation. We tell everyone ahead of time that as a part of your training, you're going to facilitate a conversation from the community, right? And in that facilitation of that conversation, we have to identify who's going to be at the table, right? What nonprofits need to be there, what municipal government leaders need to be there, what community residents need to be there, and how do we open it up so that not only the people that we think need to be there, but also the people that we might not even be thinking about show up and feel as though they have a seat at the table. And at that same time, like, how do we define the place that we're going to be regenerating, right? So we do that through asset mapping, right? Talking to people in the community, finding out who's doing what. Like one of the examples that we'll put out a call and say, okay, well, who is interested in doing a community garden in X neighborhood, right? And through that simple question, we get responses from folks all across the spectrum. On our website, we have what we call a Suggest a Project link, where people are able to go on our website and indicate what neighborhood they live or what side of town they live in and give us an idea of what they want to do. It's no judgment. You might want to do a riparian buffer, or you might want to do a tree planting in front of your house. Like, we try to open it up and get that type of data. And using that information, we're able to identify that there are people that are interested inside of this type of work in their community, and those are the folks that we need to bring to the table. Step two, we have to evaluate the place or the space. And this is an image of our most recent project, Broad Rock Community Garden. You gotta understand that spaces are multidimensional. Okay, all right, he just stood up. Okay, I'm gonna speed through my last three slides. Spaces are multidimensional. They're not just physical spaces, they also have social dynamics. So who lives in that community? What's the history of the neighborhood? Some same things about the redlining before. Then you have to get the community in the room in order to draw the vision. What's the mission? These are people that are gonna be living with this space. Not only are you a part of that community, but the folks that live in that neighborhood have to come up with what they wanna see in that space. So drawing out that vision, literally drawing out that vision with the community, is how you get folks into the mindset that they can actually plan, and be a part of the change that's happening in their neighborhoods. And then we start small. It doesn't have to be, all $10,000 at once, right? How do we build trust in the community? Small things. I mean, these are just a bunch of plants that we had inside of our nursery. We say, okay, we're gonna put these into this garden space just to get the energy rolling, getting people connected with actually planting plants in a neighborhood. Then you're doing events. Maybe we don't have to start the garden right away. Maybe we're gonna have a dinner in the middle of the neighborhood just to kind of have a conversation about it. Maybe we put signs up that express what is happening inside of the space or what could possibly happen inside of the space. So, there's small things that you do that don't cost a lot of money that can change the dynamics of the neighborhood and help build that trust. Again, going back to my last slide for my last list, it's an iterative reevaluation and a longitudinal game, right? So you're starting small, building out different efforts and initiatives, different evolutions of the space. This is from Mcdonough Community Garden, which is the first community garden that we started. This is a recent image of this amazing permeable paver path that we were able to put in by hiring students from the community to put it in, and it's like, wow, this is just as great as I would have hired somebody from, a proper contractor, right? But that's something that evolved over time. It wasn't something that just, in the beginning, we started with the permeable paver. It started with just mulch, right? But the community was like, I don't have accessibility. I got a wheelchair. It's hard as hell for me to, use my wheelchair and mulch. So we ended up investing in developing the paver. And then, it might get bigger. So this is a pergola that was built on at the Broad Rock Community Garden. That is a much larger effort, but it's something that evolved out of, the community's desire for shade space and things like that. So figuring out small things and just building up incrementally, but remembering that you're in a long-term game and that the people that are at the table in the beginning might not be the people that are at the table in the ending, but as long as you're centering community in that narrative, then you're on the right path. I have one more slide. No, actually two. In terms of a philosophical framework, I try to express and leave people with this idea, like the 12 permacultural principles, when overlaid into like our social strata on a racial level, are an excellent way to start to, figure out this puzzle of how we engage community. So, from everything from observing and interacting, using the margins, valuing the margins, using the edges, evaluating diversity, using small, slow responses, self-regulate, being able to accept feedback. I just think, even though we know, Bill Mollison, didn't come up with this stuff by himself, that he learned this from the indigenous Australian communities, using the ideas that have been promulgated through permaculture to realize equitable change in our communities is something that I think is the next level for that particular, field of study. And then in closing, my favorite, or one of my most, one of the most inspirational figures for me in agriculture is George Washington Carver. Way beyond, soybeans and peanuts, this is the gentleman that I feel is really the true father of regenerative agriculture. Way before Rodale, he was in community, teaching people how to use compost, how to, design gardens and green spaces that are pulling nitrogen from out of the air, and just so many different amazing innovations that, he doesn't get enough credit for. But one of his quotes is, and I'll close with this, start where you are with what you have, make something of it, and be never satisfied. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Well, I think I'll ask if maybe we'll do one or two. I'll open up to students first.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
We've got time for probably 2 questions, and I'd like to open it up first to any of our students that might have a question for Duron.
How do you also intersect with municipal government? Just to we have resources and ability to help these communities, and then how do you make sure that you get through any bureaucracy?
Okay. So municipal government, there's a couple of different ways that we intersect with municipal government. One of the ways that we work with municipal government is that food policy is a really easy access point for municipal government across the country. Municipal governments are trying to realize different ways to increase access to healthy food. A second way is stormwater management. Like municipal government is always trying to find new and innovative ways to reduce their reduce the nutrients that are going into rivers from farms and et cetera, and from the pollution that we create inside of our urban centers. And then third, through health departments of health across the country are trying to realize what does it mean for them to address the social determinants of health. And one of those determinants is access to walkable spaces, access to green spaces in community. And so we try to find that sweet spot where I like to say it's like multiple bangs for $1. And when you're in that room, like being able to articulate that this affects stormwater management, this can affect change in food access, this can help build civic engagement, this is also a public health issue. Like if you can rattle off at least 4, different metrics that a department inside of the city government can get behind, it's really easy to kind of get them interested. And what we've been successful with is getting funding from departments of health, from the city, from the Parks and Recreation that are looking to, turn their vacant land into community gardens, and also from our offices of sustainability that are all about civic engagement and increasing, the amount of green space in the community. So finding that sweet spot is often, you just have to kind of pay attention, look up the city's master plan or your county's master plan and try to find out what's going on in terms of greening, stormwater management, and also parks and recreation. Those are some of the easiest ways. So that's essentially what was, the program was birthed from the spirit of how do we build communities' efficacy in maintaining those spaces. And what seems to be the most catalytic is the spaces that are either A, food access spaces, or B, spaces that are oriented towards stormwater management spaces. And in that, it's like we train our volunteer coordinators and how to manage and recruit volunteers because that's a skill set, right? That's not something that people just come to the table automatically knowing how to manage 30, 15, 12 people, not alone trying to figure out how to recruit those folks. So we spend a lot of time teaching them how to not only recruit, but how to take care of your volunteers, how to get those people engaged and how to keep them engaged and keep them supportive and, not looking at volunteers as some anomalous other, but that they're integral to your organization. And then lastly, the idea of paying people for their time, especially volunteers, is not a foreign concept. So if you can figure out a way to stipend the folks that are leading your volunteers in the field, then it really increases your retention and that type of energy. People want to play a part in these efforts, but finding people that know how to manage people is super important. And when you can invest in those individuals, and it doesn't have to be I'm going to pay you money. It's how about I invest in you getting a certification, right? How about I invest in you going to X conference or Y class, and just as a part of your participation in this program, you're consistently getting some reciprocity out of it beyond just the butterflies and cupcakes from being a good volunteer coordinator.
One more round of applause, please, for Duron.
All right, thank you.
And we'll see you all over at the boat show.